Right. So again, we're here to talk about Climate Ready Oʻahu, which is an effort to develop a climate adaptation strategy for the island. But first off, before we get into it, we ask that you basically do what you would do in a public meeting. We have a little bit of a virtual sign-in sheet. I'm going to ask Sophie to drop a direct link into the chat, which will allow you to access the virtual sign-in form. And we have, again, in the same way that you would normally participate in the physical space, we want to make sure we know who's participating, know where folks are from around the island, but it also ensures that we're able to communicate with you in the latter stages of the project and keep you informed of the progress as we go along. So we'll give you all just a couple of seconds to access that sign-in sheet. And then we do have 2 additional sets of demographic questions, which we'll get to right after the sign-in. And let us know if there's any difficulty accessing this resource. Also want to offer up that obviously any of these sign-in and demographic questions are optional, but again, they truly help us in improving the process and ensuring direct lines of communications with all participants. Has everyone at least been able to access Leah, Rod, and Amanda? Got a head nod? Okay. I'm going to keep us moving right along and ask Raina to explain a little bit more as to why we're asking some of these questions.
So in addition to the kind of typical sign-in, we're trying to collect some demographic information off of our participants. And this is important not only to, understand who we are connecting with over the course of this engagement, but especially to identify who we aren't connecting with, because our community engagement is only as good as its representation of our island population here. And as this process is iterative, this information will help us reach out to the types of people that we previously hadn't connected with. Also, while the questions do require a response, you may choose to remain anonymous and select the prefer not to respond option.
Great, thank you, Raina. Yeah, we know in the virtual space, it's while it opens the doors for some people to participate, it's not necessarily the best avenue to catch everyone. So as we progress in the different rounds of project touch points and communication, we really want to stay attuned to some potential real gaps in who we're connecting with and make sure that we pivot and focus different strategies to better connect with individuals all across this island. So this just rounds out those demographic questions again, so we can better understand who we're connecting with. And again, appreciate your support in informing us about how to improve upon our activities as a city office. Okay, thanks. I think that was the same number as before. So moving right along. This is it. This is what we're going to be doing today. And as we mentioned, we'll make sure that we are all wrapped up by noon, the latest. But in essence, we wanted to give a brief project overview for anyone that was unable to participate in the first round of meetings, describe a little bit more about the specific goals of the round 2 engagements. We will offer up a quick recap of what was discussed in round 1, and then we'll give ourselves a little bit of a breather and a stretch break before we jump right into the main activity and this mapping discussion and mapping activities, and then wrap it all up with any questions that you may have or thoughts or considerations on ways to improve engagement. So with that said, we are talking about climate change adaptation today. But we would be remiss if we didn't also slow down to talk about climate change generally, as well as the things that are requiring us to adapt to changing environmental conditions that we've already experienced today, but that we're also grappling with into the future. So this is that blanket that we evolved and enables us to inhabit this planet, and it more than often keeps us warm and comfortable. However, unfortunately, we are adding more and more threads to this blanket. And we know the direct cause and driver of climate change. It's all of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And the foundational science of that has been measured right here in the state atop Mauna Loa. As you can see, from the mid-50s all the way to present, the ever increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the reason that this is really important to notice is that even if we stopped around the entire planet all of our greenhouse gas emissions, there's so much energy in that system that climate change would continue. Sea level rise will continue, increases in temperature will continue, storms, right? The manifestation of the energy in the system will express itself through violent storms, droughts, etc. That doesn't mean we can disregard the need to take aggressive climate action, but it also highlights just how important it is to think about preparing communities today and into the future for some really difficult challenges as a result of climate change, but not just dwelling on preparing for the worst, but really thinking about what are those opportunities for community and environmental improvement in the face of some of these challenges. And we know that at great expense to us today, we import the fuel source that is requiring us to now have to adapt. We export about $5 billion of our money annually to bring in the fuel sources that are requiring us to adapt to climate change. And it's quite expensive for us today, but also if we don't change the course, adaptation will become that much more expensive and risky for us into the future. So we know that climate change is intergenerational. So it's really important to think about these near to mid, but also long-term consequences of choices and or inaction, as well as the positive things that can result from taking smart, climate-informed action today. Because climate change itself is not just an environmental issue, it very much is a human health and prosperity, as well as economic prosperity issue. And we really need to turn the tide. And fortunately, even though the United States on Wednesday of this past week formally left the Paris Climate Agreement, we now have some certainty that starting come January, the process for re-engaging with the global community on climate change is now back on the table. And we're very fortunate again that we've had tremendous local leadership in this arena for many, many years recently. And even though we're talking about climate change adaptation and developing a strategy today, we just wanted to remind everyone that, you know, these discussions around climate change, both mitigating the source and our pollution, as well as preparing communities, is not a new discussion. This list just kind of shows all the climate action as well as climate adaptation discussions that have been going on around the state for, you know, more than a decade plus at this time. And you could also add in terms of environmental stewardship and environmental and cultural restoration as a really critical component of thinking about managing environmental and community change through time. So we're really also seeing a lot of the benefit of that day in, day out community restoration work that's been going on for 10, 20 years, manifesting in providing sustenance for communities, better managing rain where it falls, and really keeping us connected as people so that we can engage in these conversations. But what we're doing here today is taking information from our city climate change brief at the same time that the office was created basically 4 years ago via a city charter amendment. The voters also created a city climate change commission. And one of their foundational documents in 2018 was a climate change brief, which presented really the global and local picture about what's already been measured, what's on the horizon in the near term, and then what are some of the major changes that we think about towards the end of the century. This project is looking towards mid-century, so about the year 2050. And from that climate change brief, we had a process where the city departments looked at some of those climate hazard impacts and identified some of their top areas of concern for city infrastructure, city assets, as well as our ability to provide services for community members island-wide. And you can see a representation of some of those top hazards here, including sea level rise, coastal erosion, changes in rainfall patterns around the island, as well as increasing temperatures around the island. So in essence, what we're asking your assistance on is helping us better understand community perspectives to become sea level wise, make sure that our communities are flood ready, but also make sure that we're taking aggressive and proactive action so that we can all beat the heat and stay connected as social animals into the future. And the Climate Ready Oʻahu project is presented here. So we're currently in that first phase, rounding out round 2 of community virtual engagement. We're looking towards early to mid-September of next year for finalization. And at the various stages along the way, we have these key framing questions because we don't want to assume anything along the way. We want to make sure that everything we're doing is intentional and consistent with the information and input that's collected along the way in the earlier phases. So right now we're really honing in on what are the consequences of climate change. And the climate adaptation strategy is a direct action and indirect execution of the community sourced Oʻahu resilience strategy that some of you might be familiar with. And the intention is that this adaptation strategy will feed into and support all of our other decision-making processes, whether it's our hazard mitigation plan, our island-wide community plans, department infrastructure investment plans, as well as budget making. We're obviously at a very important transition phase right now with a new mayor-elect and several council members coming on board in early January. And we want to make sure that they are as educated and up to speed on everything that's been happening to date, but also what the community is continuously requesting in terms of adaptation measures into the future. So just to highlight, the other latter stages, we will have more open public engagement in January/February of 2021. We'll be doing more activities in April as well as in May/June, TBD on the specific dates, but just to give you a sense of where we're looking for confirmation and community expertise at the various stages in the project. But today specifically, we want to look at a series of exposure maps to help us think through potential adaptation action areas. And these are literal physical geographies that will help us as case examples to think through how to tackle, whether it's multiple hazards, how to think through adaptation strategies for cross-cutting city infrastructure and services, how do we develop the approaches to ensure that island-wide, that this information is integrated into city plans and policies, as well as allow us to explore compounding impacts of multiple hazards as informed by the community feedback, the department interactions, engagement with state agencies, as well as additional support that's being provided to us by a community advisory hui. So you can see that today in this red box, we're looking to, again, engage on the data and the science in a map form and take that information into the next stage where we will be having the specific discussions of what are our ideas around adaptation in response to the hazard information that we have to, again, not just prepare ourselves for the worst, but to think about opportunities for environmental and community improvements for decades to come. And very quickly, what was discussed in round 1 was a little bit a deeper discussion around climate change, what's been measured locally, and what steps have been taken at the state, city, and community level. We engaged in a survey to get people's thoughts and comments on climate hazard impacts. And then we started a discussion around guiding principles for climate change adaptation so that we better understood some of the value-based as well as community equity considerations for not just coming up with the ideas, but thinking about once we get to the stage of implementing them, how do we prioritize communities, ensure that we're providing benefits to areas that potentially most need it. We'll have more outcomes from the guiding principles discussion in the future public engagement. But what I wanted to highlight to you here is that you can go back and actually see the presentation materials. You could watch a recording of the round one meeting, but also we wanted to highlight that the survey is still open and we greatly appreciate your inputs into that, as well as extending that to friends and family members or colleagues. So I'm going to quickly ask that Sophie drop the survey link into the chat so that you all have it at your fingertips to take following this meeting. Any questions on what was discussed in round one, or any clarifying comments or questions regarding the general project overview and timeline at this point? Thanks, Amanda. It's helpful to see the head shaking. Okay, so we're right on time. And what we wanted to do is take a quick stretch break, but JK, it's also a moment where we're gonna quiz you. So we have a pop quiz poll I'm gonna ask Haley to open. And the question is, when was a state sea level rise report first released? Got 2/3 of the responses in. Give it a sec. Okay, I think we can close the poll now. Unfortunately, no one got it right. Actually, the answer is 1985. So I can understand that some people answered 2017, and that's probably because you're familiar with the state sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report that came out in December of that year. But actually, in 1984, there was a Senate resolution, a state Senate resolution requesting a statewide, requesting a study of the greenhouse effect on Hawaii's coastal developments. And that was introduced by state senators Anthony Chang, Malama Solomon, Charles Taguchi, James Aki, and Bertrand Kobayashi. And then in 1985, our State Office of Planning Coastal Zone Management Agency produced the report in response to the legislature's request. And it's also interesting to note that it was only in this year, 2020, that did any of our state laws actually change to include sea level rise as part of our short special management area regulations. And the point that we're just trying to make here today is that obviously our understanding of climate change has actually existed for 70 years at this point, where industries were hiding what they knew in terms of the consequences of utilizing fossil fuels in energy or ground transportation systems. But we also don't have another 35, 36 years to take immediate action on the information that's presented to us. We want to be as transparent, clear-eyed, and honest so that everyone can be just as informed as decision makers need to be to take appropriate action. So thanks for that. With that, that brings us directly into our activity today. And I'm going to hand it off to Sophie to explain a little bit about what we're engaging in.
So what we'll be doing is asking for your feedback in terms of different priority areas around the island. Obviously, climate change is affecting the entire island and everything is a priority. But just for this exercise and for the development of the strategy really honing in on some neighborhood, town, community levels for a number of reasons, whether they're affected by specific hazards or more vulnerable because of the populations that live there, any number of reasons. And so that's what we'll be asking as we go into the next slide when we get to practice the Zoom annotate feature.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So again, as Sophie mentioned, the intentional or the outcome from this is not to say that like we're only thinking about adaptation in these top areas of concern, but again, they help us explore some case examples on how to think through interdepartmental, intergovernmental challenges, better understand the community's concerns about potential disparate impacts all around the island. And we know that it might be a little odd to think at these different scales, or perhaps potentially even uncomfortable to offer concerns about certain areas over others, or think about others' experiences all around the island. But again, they're just intended to tee us up with some specific case examples to help us think through multiple issues so that we can then apply specific adaptation actions all around the island.
So this is your opportunity to test out one of the tools we'll be using for the exercise. It's the annotate feature in Zoom, which you might be familiar with already. But if not, at the top of the screen, you should be able to see a green bar that says you're viewing Matthew Gonzer's screen. Next to it, there's a view options in gray with a little down caret. And so if you click on that, you'll see the menu open. And third one down should be the annotate feature. If you're using Zoom from a browser, this might not be an option, but we're a small enough group where we really invite you to have to share your thoughts just verbally or in the chat box. It doesn't have to be through the annotate feature. But if you found the annotate feature, I encourage you to look at the different options, and under draw or stamp, which are the third or fourth options, you can actually use that to mark up the screen. So this point would encourage folks to test it out and see if it's working, and let us know if you're running into any tech issues.
Yeah, that's great. So we see some different examples here where, you know, myself and Leah were able to drop some stamps. Amanda dropped some stamps, but also found that you can draw and just, you know, circle areas as well. Any of the above, as well as we get into the activity, offering your thoughts in the chat or just unmuting yourself and speaking up is also appreciated. So just to telegraph what we're going to be doing here as you folks are demonstrating your capacity with the Zoom annotate function is we're going to go through a series of 8 maps. So you're going to see the island 8 different times, and each slide will have either different climate science data or a specific question and prompt. And that'll make sense as soon as we get into it. So it looks like everyone is up for engaging with the questions. So I'm going to clear it here and move us right along. So as I mentioned, there was a stage in the early part of the project where departments went through a process of filtering some of the climate hazards of top concern for them. And what you will now see is a series of 5 maps that shows climate science data specific to those top areas of concern. And again, they were focused on top areas of concern for their infrastructure, their assets, and their ability to provide services to community island-wide. So this first one is showing tropical storms. And what we're asking are, what are areas of top concern for storm surge and or inland flooding from tropical storms or hurricanes? And the map is actually showing a combination of two risks. One is our quote unquote 500-year flood zone from rainfall. And that is really saying that in any given year, there's a 0.2% chance that such a rain event could happen. And then you're additionally seeing modeled storm surge flooding from a Category 3 hurricane. And the important thing to note regarding storm surge is that it would be extremely dependent on the approach and track of a storm. So this kind of condition all around the island would not happen all at once. So basically, we're asking for your assistance in helping us know your thoughts around top areas of concern for storm surge and inland flooding from a tropical storm. And not just offering it on the map, but also, if you have some additional anecdote or qualifying thoughts as to why you stamped an area or circled an area, that's also appreciated. And just a little bit of additional background, Oʻahu obviously currently experiences the impacts from tropical storms, even though this island does not have a history of landfall from a tropical storm. We obviously could experience, and we've had some very stress-producing, anxiety-riddled recent examples of storms tracking very close, either just to the north or sort of taking an abrupt left turn as Hurricane Lane approached the South Shore a couple of years ago. And the climate change brief explains that more frequent tropical storms are projected for the waters near Hawaii. That's not necessarily because more storms are being produced. It's because as the ocean temperature increases, the track of the storms can also now migrate more northward, and that puts us more in line with the potential for an impact. So it looks like we have some good responses in here already on the stamp. If anyone's willing to offer some additional thoughts by unmuting yourself or in the chat as to why you selected any of those locations, that's also appreciated, so we better understand sort of the why of the concern. Because I know that the map can be a little intimidating. The map does not represent the answer. It's one component of a multiple series of components that we need to consider in thinking about decisions to prepare for the risks. It's just showing the climate science at this point.
I can go, Matt.
Thanks, Amanda.
I worked at Malama Local Ea. I was a program coordinator up there before going to Malama Pu'uloa, and we had a lot of problems with king tides and just higher than normal sea levels, just because we're directly connected with Haleiwa Bay and the Aiwa Kai, and we were already dealing with problems of inundation and high tides. So I think firsthand I saw like what's going to happen to Haleiwa and the challenges they're going to face with increased hurricanes and tidal events.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amanda. Anyone else have any additional thoughts?
On the windward side, there's a compounding problem of the highways being right on the ocean. So you have a big threat of communities being isolated. So getting help to them would be quite problematic.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rod.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Rod said. I kind of chose the Ka'ava Ha'ula region, and because they are isolated with only that one highway, they would be unable to leave should a Category 3 hurricane event occur, and it would be really hard to get aid to them as well.
Yeah, not just sort of the preparation, but the consequences after the fact. Yeah, thank you for all those. So I've already collected and recorded and saved this graphic. So this is the process. We'll go through each of the slides, offer the opportunity to basically place your digital sticky notes all around the map, talk about it a little bit, I'll record the image and then clear the drawing and move us on to the next one. So in this one, we're asking about what are areas of top concern for increasing rainfall, but as well as heavy rainfall events or rain bombs. So this is both a question of sort of the changing trends or a climate change stress, but also the concerns around a specific event or a climate change shock. And what the map is showing is information from, again, the climate change brief and our national climate assessment that tells us in the wet season, the windward side is likely to increase in precipitation up to about 30%. But we also know that heavy episodic rainfall events are becoming more frequent. So for example, like the April 2018 East Honolulu and Waimanalo rain event extrapolated into about 4 inches of rain per hour, which greatly overwhelmed the drainage systems because they're designed for a lower rain event. And we know it's a little bit difficult looking at this sort of pixelated map because it hides all of the place names as well as roadways that assist in orienting yourself. But again, we're interested in top areas of concern for general increases in rainfall and or heavy rain events. And again, as you guys are adeptly dropping your stamps and your thoughts, please don't hesitate to provide a little bit of explanation either in the chat or again, just feel free to unmute yourselves. Looks like we have some consistency along the South Shore business district through Waikiki, highlight on the Waimanalo region, Kahana Bay, and the Ko'olauloa district as well. And we also know that this question probably triggers a lot of the same thoughts from the previous event, which also had some rainfall considerations and heavy rain components as a result of tropical storms. So let us know too if you know you're just trying to upvote that or reinforce it through some of these thoughts too.
Kaka'ako floods with 5 minutes of rain. They're building the new buildings raised, but the streets are still not in great shape.
Yeah, a lot of poor or non-existent drainage in some of the light industrial sections still through Kaka'ako.
For me, I'm concerned with wastewater. So in Ka'aava, I just had an interview with a resident, and she's, you know, Ka'aava is an area where there's a lot of cesspools, and they don't have very good wastewater treatment. So if there were to be a rain bomb event, a lot of the wastewater would go right into the ocean, and that's where people swim, that's where they collect food, fish, you know, so that could be potentially very disastrous.
Yeah, Leah, could I ask that, you know, I saw you dropped your star, more Kahana area, if you could maybe drop another one slightly up the coast, more towards the Ka'aava area. Looks like Rod put another one, sort of Mapunapuna district. Any additional thoughts, Amanda?
No, not in terms of rain. And Eva, And that isn't one of our biggest concerns. We're worried about left brain.
Oh, we'll get to that. Don't worry. Oh, Leah, I saw your stars disappeared. Oh, there you go. Okay, I'm going to capture this one, I think. Okay, then I'll clear it. And we'll continue on. And some of you have actually started to talk about this as well. And what this is showing is our sea level rise exposure area as defined by that trick question, which was the 2017 Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report from the state. And then you're also seeing in orange, the areas that sea level rise exposure area tells us that we have concerns about inundated major roads or coastal highways. So the majority of this is the state highway. However, more in town, there's some concerns of our local city roads. And we know too that at this scale, island-wide, it's a little bit difficult to see all of the blue that is the sea level rise exposure area, but the road kind of reinforces that as well. Leah, I see you dropping some teeny tiny red dots.
I'm sorry, I wasn't meant to do that.
Okay. Yeah, just want to make sure you're getting your thoughts on the map as well. So a little bit more about sea level rise. We know that Oahu is currently on a trajectory to experience about 1 meter or 3.2 feet of sea level rise, at least by the year 2100, but that the impacts from these higher water levels will be seen decades before, and we already see some of it today through high tides, king tides, or other coastal high wave events. And again, sea level rise is not just one thing. It is a hazard that includes multiple components. It includes passive coastal and groundwater flooding, where areas become permanently wet. It includes annual high wave flooding, where areas become wet annually just as a result of our typical waves all around the island. But it also includes coastal erosion, or the risk and concern of permanent loss of land. Looks like we got some thoughts up along North Shore, windward Ko'olauloa region again, as well as the west side, and then concerns in town, Ala Moana, Kaka'ako area. And I think we've heard at least some of the why and the rationale behind the prioritization, as it's somewhat similar, at least in exposure to perhaps the tropical storm surge one. But if anyone has any additional thoughts or comments, please again, don't hesitate to offer them up.
I guess I can go. So right now I'm really concerned with coastal erosion, and as sea level rise, of course, rises over the course of the future, it's just going to get worse, and it's going to exacerbate king tides, winter swells, all these other events. So I tried to mark Sunset Area Beach. And I know for a fact that there are several beaches that are currently about to fall into the ocean. And right now, those people are concerned with if they're even going to make it through the winter. And what do they do when their house falls into the ocean? So along with that, the beach is shrinking. And what does that mean for access to beaches in the long run?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. And thanks for the explanation. And hopefully you're okay with this. Once you confirmed sunset, I moved your star a little bit up the coast, more toward sunset.
I couldn't really see that well.
Yeah.
So there are two routes of escape. I was actually camping in Maulai Kahana once when the road went out Punalu'u, but I was able to go around the other way. The people on the Waianae side do not have a second route.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Rod. And we've heard that repeatedly in some of the meetings as well. Great, thanks everyone. I'm gonna capture this one. Clear the drawing, move us right along. So this gets to what Amanda was talking about. So in addition to the climate science projecting wetter windward conditions, it's also projecting drier leeward conditions. And it's describing that the leeward side of the island is expected to become up to 60% drier by mid-century. So now we're asking, what are areas of top concern for decrease in precipitation? And again, you can see on the pixelated spectrum map here that the bright / hotter colors from the pinks, reds, and oranges show a greater percent decrease in rainfall, whereas the warmer colors in the green into the red still show a decrease, but at a much lower percent change. And as you're getting your stickies and notes onto the map, again, if you're able to offer up some discussion, that's greatly appreciated, and it really helps us in understanding the answers that we're collecting. And again, we know it can be a little difficult when the colors cover up the entirety of the map and we lose some of the place names. So always helpful to hear the additional thoughts in the discussion, and we can make sure that it's represented accurately in the map form.
I think that agriculture will be impacted, and there is some diminishing, maybe, I don't know, agriculture in the Waianae area.
Yeah, and that's a, that linkage is helpful, right? So the science tells us one thing, and then the changes in the climate have consequences for not just people, but sectors and industry, which then can have consequences for people. So we're trying to think through all of the ramifications of these cascading impacts. So thanks for that, Rob.
I know.
Sorry, Rod. Yep, go ahead, sorry.
Oh. Was Rod saying something?
No, I was apologizing for calling him Rob. So I wanted to reinforce Rod. Yeah.
So it's many years away before Pu'uloa, Pearl Harbor could be a food source again, but especially in light of COVID-19 and seeing how vulnerable Hawaii can be in an emergency situation, we would like Pearl Harbor to once again be a food producing region. If dry season is amplified, fish ponds, local IA, agriculture there are going to be increasingly difficult to maintain. We worry about the watershed operating the way it's supposed to. We worry about restoration efforts there, not being able to return it to former baselines.
Yeah, restoration, it's an interesting concept, right? I mean, sort of like, it raises the question of restoring to what, but if those defaults and those baselines are changing, the concept of restoration and stewardship also has to evolve and prepare for what the different conditions may be into the future. Yeah, thanks for that, Amanda and Rod. if everyone's comfortable with what's represented on the map, I'm going to, again, capture this, clear all the drawings, unless I hear otherwise. Okay. And then our last climate hazard is increasing temperature, which obviously also has relationship to changes in rainfall as well. But now we're asking, what are areas of top concern for increasing temperature? So Oahu is expected to experience an increase in annual average temperature of 2.7 degrees to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. What you're seeing here is not an extrapolation of changes in temperature on an annual basis. What we actually wanted to talk through is what was captured by community volunteers last year to help us better understand a community heat index. So you're seeing really sort of the quote unquote urban area, or where people live around the island. And you're seeing the heat index from August 31st, 2019. And the heat index is a combination of temperature and humidity, basically representing what people feel and what is our experience when we are outside exposed to the conditions. And you can see from the map that there are many places around the island that were up in the triple digits in terms of a heat index that day. And there were almost a dozen places that were greater than 105-degree heat index. And this information was collected by volunteers who covered the island along at three different times of day, covering the same sort of route to collect temperature and humidity information, which was then modeled for the landscape and community scale. And that day just happened to be the hottest day of the year for Honolulu, but also tied Honolulu's highest record temperature of 95 degrees. So not only was the temperature just itself 95 degrees out near the airport station, but what it felt like for certain people around the island was into the triple digits, and in some places, again, greater than 105. Basically, this map tells us how hot it can already get and feel today. So that then begs the question and concern for increasing temperatures into the future. And we saw, I think those were Amanda's checks out of the gate. If you have any additional comments, Amanda.
Yeah, in West Block specifically, where we're working right now, West Block Estate is a decently affluent area. I think it's safe to assume that most have access to air conditioner and would be okay, but I do worry about other parts of Eva and along the Waianae coast where access to AC and other ways to cool down is not as easily affordable, and vulnerable communities already, the Kapuna, and people that won't be able to tolerate the heat as well. That's concerning.
Thank you for that. So Leah dropped a star down in Kaimuki as well.
Yeah, sorry, I'm really bad at geography. I'm gonna try to move the star a little bit more towards Honolulu, but just taking into account the urban heating effect, and with increasing temperatures, it's just gonna get hotter there. And within that region itself, there are communities that don't have, access to AC. So that's pretty worrying to me.
Yeah, feel free to drop another star, just a little bit more to the left to make sure that we capture more towards additional places in Honolulu. Give this one a couple more seconds. So after this, we'll see 3 more maps of Oahu, and that'll wrap up the activity. So really appreciate everyone participating and navigating the virtual sticky note of the Zoom annotate function. Rod, it looks like you dropped some stuff down into like Kalihi area, Palama, Liliha. Any additional notes for us to make sure we capture?
Yeah, I think those are probably also older neighborhoods. I was trying to go all the way to Kalihi and Liliha, all that entire area, where it's likely the older housing doesn't have air conditioning.
Great, thank you. Okay, going to capture this one as well. Clear it and move us along. So the next three are blank maps. And this one, the next couple of questions really think about different categories of consequences. And those categories look across people in places, the environment of that place, as well as the economy of the island. And you've all, through the previous 5 hazard impact slides, provided a little bit more of that explanation as to why. But again, we're going to ask you here the specific prompt: where will changes in climate that result in temporary or permanent damage and disruption most impact the people that live in that area? And this is to help us, even though we've captured a lot of the rationale and the thought and the thinking behind the previous responses, this sort of opens it back up to helping us understand the potential disparate impacts and consequences for the people that live in that specific area of the island. And even though we haven't really shown it today, because we're kind of focusing in on the climate science and the climate data, we did want to share with you some additional resources that looks at the human side of it, right? The human consequences of some of this stuff. So a big component of the climate adaptation work is to better understand conditions of vulnerability, potential conditions of vulnerability for people around the island, and how to support with additional adaptive capacity through this process to align some of our decision-making towards implementation of any of the strategies. So what was put in the chat is some joint resources from our adaptation team, as well as our equity and climate resilience team, looking at some additional human demographic information with respect to climate hazards. It looked like some concurrence across participants here. Before I capture and move us along, anyone want to maybe reinforce or share again what the thinking was there? If not, no worries. I think it was well understood and captured in some of your previous comments. So I'm going to grab this one again, clear the drawings. And now the next question, and Amanda was already thinking about some of this: where will changes in climate that result in temporary or permanent damage and disruption most impact the environment in that area? So the ecological systems, the baseline environmental conditions specific to that area. So again, thinking across those 5 climate hazard conditions of catastrophic tropical storm or changes in rainfall, either too much or too little, or really episodic deluges of rain, as well as sea level rise, coastal erosion, and or increasing temperatures.
Like
Amanda's
the
going.
bad job of drawing this, but I'm worried about the two major watersheds, the Honouliuli and Alawai. We all know that the watersheds are in trouble, but they won't be impacted as much from coastal events, I don't think, but the rainfall and many things, they're so interconnected, I worry the whole watershed is very vulnerable to it.
So you said Alawai. I'm going to draw Alawai for us because it looks like you grabbed sort of Moanalua stream on the right-hand side there. Is it okay to either remove that?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm putting down the Ka'ava Ha'ula region again because with everything, with the rain bombs affecting wastewater and increasing temperatures, it's not creating a very good environment for the living resources in the ocean. So we've seen a huge decrease of limu production there, and even like tumors in honus. So just from that alone, we know that there's huge impacts from the climate.
Thanks for that, Leah. Any additional thoughts, Rod, before I capture this one and move us to our final graphic?
Well, there's so many human impacts on the environment that it's hard to, I think they kind of outweigh maybe the climate change impacts.
Interesting. Yeah, good thought. Well, I mean, climate change in and of itself is also a human impact. So it's a good point.
Yeah.
So are you comfortable? Is
Direct
it okay?
Impacts.
Yeah. Okay with you if I capture this, clear it, and move us on?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one is, whereas the other ones we're thinking about impacts to the people in that place or the environment in that place, what we're thinking of now is at a different scale. Where will changes in climate that result in temporary or permanent damage and disruption most impact the economy for the entire island? And maybe just to provide some additional insight as to why we are asking these questions is because we don't want to assume anything, but we also need to figure out evaluation criteria to think about multiple factors for helping us hone in on specific case examples to think through the adaptation actions. We obviously cannot lose sight about environmental consequences or the human consequences for different populations around the island. But we also don't want to just discredit some of the economic consequences where there might be outsized impacts for sort of the prosperity of people all around the island just because of specific concentrations of resources or, you know, folks circling in there, sort of Honolulu Harbor and the economic centers through Waikiki. I didn't see the names, but the circling on the Waianae or North Shore, if you want to offer up the additional thoughts as to those.
I think that the Waianae is pretty vulnerable right now economically. A very long commute. I know people who have had to quit their jobs because they just can't work downtown and do their family responsibilities. And with the heat increase and so on. Anyway, that's enough.
In terms of North Shore, for me, I feel like that is a huge asset. The beaches are a huge asset to our tourism. So with coastal erosion and there's going to be major beach loss, that's going to impact the visitors coming in, especially because North Shore attracts a lot of surfers. It's a surfer hub. And with the big surfing events, if beach loss continues to happen, it's going to be harder to attract the sort of activity over there and affect our tourism.
Yeah, thanks, Leah, and thanks, Rod, too. Right, you know, Rod's comment and Leah's comment remind us that it's not just the conditions of that place, but either the people that then have to make their way to different parts of the island to actually provide the economic, you know, participate in the economy of that area, need to obviously get to and from, but also just the systems and the environmental conditions attract people to come and participate in the economy of the island.
The Army Corps proposal for the Alawai suggests that there is an attitude among some that we've invested too much and we have to defend.
Yeah, thanks for the additional anecdote. Sort of, and that's an interesting point. You know, obviously we are very much in reaction mode for climate change adaptation to decisions or indecisions that almost preclude different pathways moving forward. So it's important that we are real about some of these conditions and engage in the discussions head on. So unless there's anything additional, Amanda, is it okay if I capture this and move us on? Okay. And that actually wraps up our session today in terms of the intention and the goals that we were trying to accomplish today. To let you all know, this information in combination with the two other sessions that were hosted on Monday and just yesterday, along with an interdepartmental workshop that was held this week on Wednesday, and the next community advisory HUI, which is the advisory HUI meeting, which is on next week, Monday, late afternoon, will help us put forth a proposal to our internal city resilience team for what are the adaptation action areas that we will carry forward into the next phase of the project. And maybe I'll just put that back up so you all can see how what you did fits into the work that's coming forward. And as I'm doing that, I just wanted to see if there were any additional comments or questions from today's participants. So again, we just, you know, we're nearly wrapping up this first phase of the project, really better understanding the consequences of a changing climate. You all just participated in helping us think through the exposure information and the adaptation action areas. From this activity, we'll be going down into the next phase of the project to think about how do we prioritize the specific actions in response to the people, environment, economy categories, as well as the climate science. After many months of that discussion on what are the things that the city really has direct influence over, what are the things that we need to better coordinate with community organizations, as well as ensure that we are informing and collaborating with state agencies to think about multiple challenges in different locations. There will be a period of synthesis and analysis from the multiple stages of the project where, in essence, we're writing so that we can come out with the draft material. But also during this phase of the work, early spring, March and April, we'll be engaging in more discussion around equity and decision-making support recommendations to provide clear guidance and strong opinions for our incoming leaders. Then in the late spring, early summer, we'll be coming back with some draft materials to ensure that the adaptation actions address the climate risks and consequences, and that people generally feel like it is consistent with the feedback to date. And then another little quiet time as we finalize the decision-making support materials to provide recommendations on how the information from the adaptation strategy can directly inform city budget decisions, as well as our community plans, our hazard mitigation plan, and really pepper and become integral in how decisions are made across the board for leadership, intergovernmental relationships, but also supporting community in the good restoration work that you are all engaged in island-wide. So with that, stop sharing so we can maybe see faces again, and we're happy to take any additional questions you may have at this time. If there aren't any, just a big sincere mahalo nui loa for joining us on your Saturday morning, and we look forward to your participation at later stages of the project.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rod.
Thanks. I actually did have a question.
Great.
So during the process of your Climate Ready Oʻahu project, what has the levels of engagement been, especially in correlation with these areas of like high exposure to the climate hazards? Because in my research project, I have been interviewing folks from Sunset Beach, Kahala, and Ka'ava, and they all kind of cite that there hasn't been great existing management, or there's no one really coming out from the government side and talking to them, bringing awareness to these hazards and kind of like giving them reassurance that things are in the works and, you know, to like care for their houses, their communities, their beaches, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, great question. Even though we're talking about this right now, I mean, I can only speak for our office right now. So we've really only been in existence for about 3.5 years with staff. We have gone to every neighborhood board twice in that period of time. So there's 33 neighborhood boards around the island. First, it was to engage on climate science. What is this new governmental office, as well as to solicit their feedback and support for the production of the resilience strategy, which again, this project is an outgrowth of that. And then the second round was coming back out to them with the resilience strategy itself to show how the feedback directly influenced those specific tactical actions to address multiple challenges and opportunities. We work with other departments on specific projects. So for example, the North Shore Sustainable Communities Plan will actually be coming up for an update in the start of 2021. And one thing when we were thinking about this project in particular was recognizing that the real challenges of engaging with people, right? You know, this is very limiting in terms of a virtual engagement process. We knew that that was a gap. So we developed a community advisory hui, which actually is about 42 people. It's almost too large to adequately manage, but we thought it was more important to ensure representation from around the island. And it was intentional in our invitations to somewhat over sample, if that's the term we want to use, basically over invite from some of these top areas of concern, as well as some of the disparate demographic information that we have. And what we're really trying to rely upon is their connection with community to help us ensure that we are being provided the direct communication lines with, whether again, it's neighborhood boards, homeowners that they've been engaged with, or other governmental agencies. One thing that your comment highlights is the intergovernmental jurisdictional challenges, which we need to immediately overcome, because communities shouldn't necessarily care whether it's the state DLNR or the state DOT that really is leading on the beach preservation or the coastal highway preservation. They should just know that somebody's out there supporting to assist them in grappling with the reality of the challenge. And using Sunset in particular, there's been a fair amount of emergency beach management activities, as well as a fair amount of illegal shoreline hardening. And the balance in all this discussion, and it truly is a balance, right? Climate adaptation is not going to be painless necessarily. And oftentimes the costs come before the benefits. And we need to think long-term, because if we take some perhaps reactionary measures today, that might then mean that we don't have things in the future, for example, like the beach. And that's a really difficult discussion when someone is perhaps not able to sleep at night because they hear waves undermining their lanai or impacting their house. And that kind of community discussion needs to happen fast in a lot of places. And we need to find ways to not preclude decisions in the future. So if the general sentiment is, yes, we want beaches into the future, we need to find a way to support people to get out of harm's way and give them an out, so that they don't take the quite rational measure of immediately doing the thing to protect their property and their home. And that's not honestly something that we immediately have an answer for. And we would very much welcome, especially it sounds like you have some great relationships out in the community already, Leah, understanding research that's being done at the university, or understanding conversations that community leaders and community organizations are already having, so that we can support the vision that the community has.
Thank you, Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are doing work at the university right now, looking at managed retreat options and what the sentiment that the community has. So as far as the people that we've talked to, they're saying that they're willing to make the sacrifice for the preservation of the beach, which is good in the long run. But we're also thinking about what that entails now, such as just compensation. How do we help them move from the Kai to Mauka areas? So, and you're right, like it's hard to get engagement in COVID virtual settings. So we're just trying to work through that and get more engagement. So thank you for your response.
Yeah, and I know sometimes there's reluctance out of the university to offer preliminary findings or preliminary results, but if there's any opportunity to share with us interim things, that's greatly appreciated, because we can't necessarily wait 2 years for the final published journal article. We need to really learn from and help enact as immediately as possible any of the things consistent with community sentiment.
Right, I totally agree.
You can tell McKenna I said that.
Okay, yeah, I'll talk to my community team and maybe get in contact with Ujay since yeah, I have some contact with him.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so again, we're happy to hang if there's any additional specific questions on the project. If not, I'm going to ask Haley to stop the recording, but we're also willing to hang and linger if you have any.